Okay, today we begin Japan. Japan is an island nation, and 4/5 of its land is too mountainous to farm. And so the fact that it has very little farming is going to greatly impact Japan and how it develops as a nation. So, populating the islands, it is an archipelago. Like I said, it's a chain of islands. The four main islands are Hokkaido, Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku. And those four main islands are going to hold the majority of the Japanese population. Now, the native population of Japan are called the Ainu, and they are hunters-gatherers society. They didn't have any cities and no writing. They, in fact, are kind of closer to European ancestry than they are to Asian ancestry, so that makes it kind of interesting for the Japanese historical biography, I guess. But we know that they existed first on Japan because of the pottery that was found there. Japan's creation myth is kind of an interesting thing. They believe that they are descended from Amaterasu, which is a sun goddess in their religion of Shintoism. And because of that, their emperor is directly descended from Amaterasu, and that's what makes the emperor special. Now, the emperor's role up until 1945, with the end of World War II, is that he is the governing power. He leads them in the government, and he is the leader of spiritual matters too, because he has that direct connection to the sun goddess Amaterasu. Now, in order for families to gain power, you married into the emperor's family for power and influence. And that makes Japan very different from China, because remember, China, we'd have different dynasties where each family comes to power. But in Japan, we have different periods, which is marked by what's happening during that time period, not families so much as it is in China. So, the native religion of Japan is called Shintoism, which translated means the way of the gods. And Shintoism is the native religion, and it believes in kami, or spirits. And these spirits are good and pure and positive, and so they are things that they seek for guidance, for goodness in their lives. Now, the first period of Japan is called the Jomon period, and Jomon means cord or rope mark, and so it's called the Jomon period because of the pottery that's found that has cord markings on it, so that's how it gets its name. But what we see happening in the Jomon period is it's a very diverse time for Japan. There's a lot of migration from other lands, including China and Korea and Vietnam are going to be coming into Japan. And because of that, we're going to see a lot of conflicts. There's often fighting taking place. But it's a hunter-gatherer society. Eventually, agriculture will be introduced. They wore clothes that were made of bark. They made pottery with cords holding the clay together until it dried, so that's how it got the cord marking. They lived in stilt houses and had pit dwellings, so lots of major changes taking place as a civilization. Next, we get the Yayoi period, and the migrations are going to continue there. Bronze and iron are going to be utilized in their weapons, making them better. Bronze will be the first metal in Japan to be used. Pottery becomes even more sophisticated, a little bit nicer looking, I guess, classier looking. And wet rice will be introduced because of irrigation methods being introduced in agriculture. Trade and technology will continue to see some changes as well. The next period is known as the Kofun period, or transitional period. Iron swords and armor will be used during this time. Tools and pottery, again, are going to be improved upon. They also will have burial chambers with clay figurines called haniwa, which are symbolic of the kami in order to get a good spirit to go with you into the afterlife. We know more about this time period, the Kofun period, in Japan because the Koreans and the Chinese write about it. They often compare themselves to the Japanese. And so the Chinese written records give us some pretty good information about this time period. There's still no cities and no native writing for the Japanese yet. They're still developing as a civilization. The first major period is going to be called the Yamato, and the Yamato period is the first state. It's a part of Japan. It's not all of Japan, it's just a small part of Japan. But what happens in the Yamato period is that there's more than 100 different kingdoms, but they're all going to be ruled by a queen, and this queen is Queen Himiko, and she rules a territory known as Yamato. So Yamato is the first state. That's the time period. They do have horses will be introduced in this time. They'll have a cavalry. They'll have alliances with other people in the area. And they do push the Ainu out of the Yamato area, and the Ainu are going to become even more remote places to live. They continue immigrations with China and Korea, and so we'll see a lot of influences from those two areas in art and scholarship in Japan. You can see a lot of similarities. The next period is the Asuka period, and this is when Buddhism will arrive in Japan, roughly the 6th century. And with Buddhism, the Japanese get the concept of an afterlife and death, and this is going to help unify Japan, and it also brings them some ties with China, and they start to copy what China is doing. And so they begin to send out missions to China, and they learn Chinese ways, and they bring them back to Japan, and they adopt the Chinese ways, and in some ways they adapt them to the Japanese way of life. It's called selective borrowing, where they pick and choose what they want. And for example, the Chinese form of writing, they like the Chinese form of writing because the Japanese didn't have one, so they bring it back and they change it, they tweak it. So that's why Japanese and Chinese forms of writing look very, very similar. It's because they took it from the Chinese, but they tweaked it to make it reflect their beliefs and reflect their values. The next period is called the Nara period, and the Nara period is named for the capital. The capital moves every time that the emperor dies. Because they believe that the place was polluted with death, and so the capital moves every time the emperor dies. And so the Nara period is a change. In 712, the Kojiki, and in 720, the Nihongi are going to be written, and these are both records that contain like the Japanese creation myth and the history of Japan up to that point, utilizing that form of writing that they got during the Asuka period from the Chinese. Well, migrations begin to slow down during this time period. They continue to have their missions to China. They continue to learn things from China, like they will learn a coinage system using coins for money. They learn their high culture from China, that the elite of Japan are going to be very similar to the elite of China. If you remember, in China we talked about how the rich would wear really long silk robes, that their sleeves would drag on the ground, and they'd grow their fingernails out really long, and all that kind of stuff, because they wanted to show that they didn't have to work, that they were thinkers, they weren't doers. And so Japan kind of adopts some of that as well. Eventually, the families are going to be divided into family clans called uji, and the uji are very similar to the banner system of China, where they are very loyal to their families, and the family means everything. The division of government will take place at this time as well. The emperor is going to be convinced by the uji that he is too good to work on the government stuff, that he needs to focus more on spiritual guidance and leave the dirty work, leave the government work to the uji. And so the clans, the uji, are going to take over the real power of Japan at that point. And so then we'll start to see more of a development of government interference, I guess, at that point in Japan.